I'm your Huckleberry.
Law and order every time, that's us.
You ever get that sinking feeling? You know, the one that you feel you've only heard maybe half the story? Or even a different story altogether? Hello and welcome to the Red Pill Diary. I'm Lewis, and I'll be your host. So, ready or not, let's flip the switch and shed some light on it. On the night of July 10th, 1804, it was hot and muggy. You know, that's typical New York weather that time of year. 2.5 miles north of what is now Hoboken, New Jersey, and across the Hudson River from New York is the village of Weehawken. At the foot of the cliff, the Palisades is a grassy ledge approximately 6 feet wide and 35 feet long. It's secluded and only accessible by boat during low tide. On this night, two separate parties rowed across the Hudson. They rowed because honor was at stake. One man would stand in the approximate spot his eldest son had stood and fell years earlier. Today, this day, a Democrat-Republican and a Federalist, both disfavored by the current administration, bitter rivals vying to revive their political careers, would stand facing each other. The seconds had loaded their guns, prepared the pistols, and the men stood in their positions. They stood ready. The command was given and shots were fired. Only one would walk away. Both political careers were ending. One, 24 hours later, at Bayard's house in New York, and the other, from the treacherous mind and heart of another. It was sunrise, July 11th, and 1804. And the men were Alexander Hamilton and Vice President Aaron Burr. For this backstory, we only have to go back, let's say, 4 years, 1796. So we know what happened. One thing had happened in 1796. The commander of the army, Mad Anthony Wayne, passes. It's also an election year. This is the end of the second term of George Washington. Elected this time as the second president of the United States was John Adams, a Federalist. The vice president, based on the reading of the Constitution at the time, the second highest votes went to Thomas Jefferson, who happened to be a Democrat-Republican from Virginia. The problem was that you have two different political ideologies between two of the top leaders in the executive branch, the president and the vice president. That becomes a problem. It also is indicative because of the contest between Adams and Jefferson. It sets the stage for some other things that we have seen already in the beginning between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. This is all going to play out over the next decade. Compounding the issues between these parties, Jefferson and Adams, the Federalists, and the Democrat Republicans, there was this ongoing and very contentious battle for the spot in 1796. And John Adams, in his administration, had Congress pass this Alien Sedition Acts at 1797, 1798, in that period of time. Remember that date, remember that issue, because we're going to come back to it in another episode. And George Washington passes in 1799. So during this period of time, we have a lot of things going on. There's a war between France and Spain that gets settled. Washington and Alexander Hamilton, who then becomes a general, is involved in leading during this, what they call the quasi-war with France during this period of time. We also see the passing of Mad Anthony Wayne, the Major General and the head of the Army, and essentially that moving to Brigadier General James Wilkinson. Now, James Wilkinson was a friend of Aaron Burr. He knew Aaron Burr through his family connections with the Biddles, Charles Biddle. Charles Biddle was a friend. Now, remember that name, Biddle, because it's going to come up again in a future episodes with the Biddle family. The Biddle family was a very important and influential family in Philadelphia at the time. Burr knew Wilkinson through the Biddles. He would then become the commander-in-chief of the Army as they had it at that point in time, while Aaron Burr was vice president of the United States. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In 1800, the two parties running for president was not John Adams, because he was disfavored, more because of the Alien Sedition Act and some other reasons, which we'll cover in another episode. The contention was between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And at the end, when the election of 1800, the electoral votes were tied. So it went to the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives had 35 votes. It wasn't until Alexander Hamilton got involved and started to work on behalf of Thomas Jefferson. Now remember, Alexander Hamilton is a Federalist. So he wanted Jefferson to be president over Burr, even though Burr and Jefferson were both Democrat Republicans. So he tried real hard to make sure that Burr did not get elected. Well, Jefferson had a few interesting things up his sleeve, and he started working secretly behind the scenes through an agent to try to get, and was successful in getting, a electoral votes split between him and Aaron Burr in exchange, here's the quid pro quo, for an administrative office in Philadelphia. And lo and behold, Thomas Jefferson is elected president by one vote over Aaron Burr. Now, you can see where that probably wouldn't settle very well for Aaron Burr. And likely Aaron Burr would know that Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton prevented him from being the president of the United States. There was no love lost between these three individuals, Jefferson, Burr, and Alexander Hamilton. Now, Aaron Burr is the vice president for Thomas Jefferson, who he did not like. And Thomas Jefferson did not like Aaron Burr. So you can see the problem already fermenting between these two characters. And we know how that ended up for Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. The irony in all this is if you research and look up the character and the issues, personal and political, between Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, and Alexander Hamilton, you were going to find that they're very similar in their moral, questionable activities. We'll put it at that. But they are very similar, and it relates to some of the things that each one was accusing one of the other one of such behavior they were doing as well. Burr and Alexander Hamilton both had issues of infidelity, had issues of, the types of back channel deals they were doing. Jefferson was no different in the sense of what he had going on. All this stuff was just fermenting in the press. That's why we're going to go back to the Alien Sedition Act. Each party had their own newspaper where they would publish these things under pseudonyms, which is nom de plumes, and they would then publish these stories against the other party to bring them out into the open with all these basically airing their dirty laundry in front of the entire population through these newspapers. Now, you can see where that would create a lot of hurt feelings between these individuals. I mean, just imagine having all your dirty laundry shoved out in front of everybody so that everybody would think poorly about you while the other person is sitting there just basically throwing this stuff out there, acting as if they have nothing to hide. Now, let's pause for a moment. Does that behavior sound familiar? You just think about what's going on right now. Who's using the press and what is the press doing today that's similar to what happened historically in 1800, even in 1804 and onward? We see that happening. It's not new. It doesn't make it right. But when people say, oh, this is new, or this never happened, so I can't believe people are doing this, or I can't believe they're using social media to do this, well, you need to realize that historically, this has happened. This won't be the first time you'll see it, and this won't be the last time we'll see it now. This, unfortunately, is the reality of human nature in the quest for power. So during this period of time, Jefferson purchases, on behalf of the United States, the Louisiana Purchase. And why is that important? Because at this point in time, Brigadier James Wilkinson is now in charge of the military. He's stationed down in the New Orleans territory, and he is in the pay of the Spanish government. Now, this is the thing that Matt Anthony Wayne suspected but couldn't prove and died before he could actually prove it. So he's down here in the pay of the Spanish government. He's also the friend of Aaron Burr, but Aaron Burr does not know that he's in the pay of the Spanish government. And he meets with Aaron Burr prior to the duel between him and Alexander Hamilton, because there's this unrest on the western slope. Remember, we talked about the war with the Indians with George Washington and the Kentucky and Ohio and all the fighting and squabbling and the problems with the Mississippi River. There was this push to be a different country. They just felt like they were different and needed to be represented differently. And that's just a very broad generalization, and I'm sure there's historians that would, strongly disagree with that assessment. But from my read, that's what I kind of get out of it. But this is not the only movement for secession. And you think, oh, well, that was back in the Civil War was the first time. No, the New England had this kind of a want to become a separate from the powerhouse Virginia and the issues with the Democrat Republicans. And a lot of them were Federalists. They wanted to have their own kind of a confederacy. That never materialized, but it was there. It was bubbling inside. And Burr was very sensitive to that. He understood that. So that was part of the discussions that was going on behind the scenes. Burr also ran for the governor of New York, but was pushed out of that by the Clinton, Livingston families that were the powerhouse at the time in New York. And so remember those names. They're going to come up again. Well, Wilkinson approaches Aaron Burr about Mexico and Texas, and then bringing that together so they could create their own country. And this, of course, is what you would hear the people talk about, the Burr conspiracy. And this is happening right at the time that Jefferson splits the Louisiana Purchase, but he also sends, in 1804, he sends, of course, we know, the Lewis and Clark expedition. But what they don't know, and what we do now know historically, was that because of Wilkinson's connection with the Spanish, he'd already notified them that Clark and Lewis were on their way to the Pacific. He actually suggested to the Spanish, which they found out later on, they should intercept them and capture them. And the Spanish actually sent out 4 expedition, 52 men, to capture them. Fortunately for Lewis and Clark, they made it to the Pacific, as we have seen in previous episodes. But Wilkinson was at the hands of that with the Spanish, unbeknownst to the other people, Burr and others. Now, Wilkinson and Burr were hoping that the Spanish and British there would be a war begin. And if they could get a war with Spain, they could just march in to Mexico City and capture all of Texas and all the property, the land in the United States at the time that Spanish held, and also into Mexico City, and all the silver that was in Mexico that was being brought out of the Sierra Madre. Now, Burr had actually been in discussions with Britain to get some frigates stationed off of New Orleans so he could go into Mexico through Veracruz, the port, and head straight to Mexico City. That didn't materialize. When that started to break up, Wilkinson got nervous. So what did Wilkinson do? He betrayed Burr to Jefferson, of course, who Jefferson didn't like. Wilkinson wasn't a friend of Jefferson's either. He wasn't really a friend of anybody unless it served Wilkinson's needs. Now remember, Wilkinson was getting $10,000, $8,000, $9,000 in 1790, 1800. That's a lot of money to basically sell out information to the Spanish, unbeknownst. Now, people suspected it, but they could never prove it. Jefferson brought Aaron Burr in and tried him for treason, but they weren't successful. Well, why is that? Well, it's because James Wilkinson needed to protect himself because he was a co-conspirator, and he actually modified the actual letter he had given Jefferson, and it was found out at the trial, and Aaron Burr was acquitted. They tried to court-martial James Wilkinson, but he was acquitted as well. So you wonder, how did Wilkinson, and by the way, he was termed Agent 13 in all the correspondence with the Spanish, how did he keep his position, despite the suspicions? I mean, we've seen in the last couple episodes about the things that he was doing and the questionable conduct that he had with the Lewis and Clark expedition, with Matt Anthony Wayne, and with the Conway Cabal. You wonder, there's like 4 administrations he's actually involved with. Washington administration, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. So you ask, well, why is it that they didn't do anything? Well, there's probably a couple of reasons, at least in my mind. One, he actually controlled the army. Recall what we talked about an episode ago, Julius Caesar, the 8th Legion, the River Rubicon. Remember what happens when the Legion is aligned with its leader? This is Julius Caesar, and why they didn't want him to go into Rome. You can see that this was the issue with the Federalists. They wanted a large army. The Democrat Republicans didn't, for this very reason. The leader of the army controlled the army. And if they had the right people in place, guess what happens? The army follows its leader. Funny. You wonder how come the military gets changed like it has in the last couple elections. Look what's happened to the military over the last 3 years. for example. I agree or disagree, but look at it. It's different. What's different about it? It's changed. The leadership has changed. Look what's coming out now in the news media, as much as they're trying not to, about what the conduct of and were of some of the people in the administration. So also, Wilkinson was also the senior military official. And they didn't have a lot of people that were brigadier generals or major generals that had had the military experience that Brigadier General Wilkinson had. Doesn't matter whether you like him or don't like him, or whether you think he's a good general or not. He was probably one of the few still in active duty at the time that even served during the Revolutionary War. And also, you wonder, he was useful for Jefferson. Jefferson didn't like Aaron Burr. Well, how is he going to fix that? Well, he's going to fix that by keeping him in place so he can get information, and hopefully he can use the Army to deal with Aaron Burr. And because they may have had some input or inclinations this was going on, but that's easier to control because you know, sort of like that old saying, the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. They knew what they were getting with James Wilkerson, ego and all. And sometimes if you know someone is easily manipulated by manipulating their ego, well, you keep them in place because you know how to control them. Wilkinson was very good at his tradecraft as a spy. He deflected well. He undercut his opponents. He seemed to have a good sense of how to get himself out of this and put himself in a place where he would cover for himself. And his ego and narcissism and his ability to deflect was great in the way that he was able to keep people at bay. How does this relate to the present? I had some thoughts about this this rabbit trail I was going on about Agent 13. You think about what was going on and you think about today, we're going to see this type of thing coming out periodically over the course of history. What kind of conduct have we seen over, say, the last decade? Think about what we just talked about, Burr and Jefferson and Wilkinson and Hamilton and Adams, and we're going to talk about some other people. Think about this political conflict and just this undercurrent of ability to try to undercut their competition. Think about the current cycle we're in and think about what you see presently. Doesn't matter what side of this thing you're listening to, but doesn't it really kind of resonate that these things are still in there? Well, why is that? Well, because human nature is consistent. It's been that way before. Think about the division between Federalists then and the Democrat Republicans and the current parties and their division. Look how wide it is. It was wide like that before. That's why these things were going on. Think about the newspapers and what they're doing. And we're going to get a better picture of that in the next episode. But think about the newspapers and these periodicals that they put out. It was pure propaganda. And the people that were putting this information in were actually Jefferson and Hamilton and Burr. They were all putting it in there. The Clintons and Livingston. And these people were putting this information out there and putting it in these things in Philadelphia and New York. And they were reaching their audience and throwing all this stuff out there and airing all this dirty laundry so that they could defeat their opponents by just showing how immoral they are. Now, does that sound familiar? Taking somebody's personal information, plastering it all over social media, just so they can brand them immoral and take a position that they hold the high road when in reality they don't. So you see, it has happened before and it is happening right now. Now, put what's happening today in the context of what we just got done talking about. Sound familiar? Why? Because it's the same old tactic, just a different time. So think about these political families that we're going to see. And this is not new. You're going to see this consistently throughout history. They're going to have some people families that are going to rise up, bankers, merchants, very wealthy, and people that see themselves as elite and knowledgeable, and they're going to dominate the politics of that particular time. These three states in the beginning, New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, dominated the politics at this time period. And we're going to see this happening throughout history with different families, different political parties, and different states. They're going to dominate, and they're going to create a lot of mudslinging, misinformation, and essentially they're just going to outright lie about stuff. It's hard to tell the truth. We need to get down to understanding what's being put out in front of us, be able to be discerning about information and where it's coming from, and taking that and saying, okay, how do I line that up with what may or may not be true? And then history gives you a guide of saying, I'm going to give me some healthy skepticism of what I'm actually seeing. No, we've seen this before. It happened in 1796. It happened in 1864. It happened in 1907. If we understand history and the context and remember human nature and use that as a guide, we can put things that are happening today in context and have a better perspective than what's being told to us. We need to remember that what we see and hear or are being told may not always be the truth, may not always be what it looks like. Think about what's unfolding today, because history gives us a pause, a place to put things in greater context. So next time someone cries conspiracy theory or asserts that this has never happened again, you got to say, wait a minute. Just like James Wilkinson, who ended up living in Mexico City and dying there and being remembered, as he ought to be, as a traitor, a very artistic traitor. So, did someone mention sedition? You know, next time, we're going to talk about the alien and sedition laws, and you're going to find out that this may not be the whole story. Until next time, I'll leave the lights on for you. Well, we filled those pages. If you have comments, suggestions, share them. You know, the more input, the more likely a better outcome. I'm moving forward because backwards is not an option. I've turned the lights on here, and I'll be leaving them that way. Join me next time on The Red Pill Diary.